We often look to stories for clear lessons, for heroes who win and problems that get solved. But some of the most profound stories aren't about simple victories. They're about silence, about loss, and about holding on to faith when life stops making any sense. This is the story of Job, a man who lost everything, yet still chose to believe. Before the storm, Job's life was a picture of peace and order. Imagine the morning light stretching across his vast lands, servants preparing the fields, and his herds moving peacefully over the hills. His home wasn't a palace, but it was filled with something far more valuable, the laughter and conversation of a family living in harmony. Job wasn't a king or a famous warrior. He was simply a good man, respected by his community for his fairness, honesty, and quiet compassion. He helped the poor without seeking recognition and settled disputes with wisdom. Every morning, before the world awoke, he would rise to pray for his children. Not because they were wicked, but because a parent's love always worries, even about mistakes unseen. To everyone who knew him, Job's life seemed like perfect proof that goodness is always rewarded with blessing. Then, without warning, that perfect world shattered. One afternoon, his servant came running, his face etched with panic, his clothes covered in dust. Raiders had stolen the oxen and killed the servants guarding them. Before the shock could even register, another messenger arrived. Fire from the sky had consumed all the sheep. And then another, with news that raiders had taken the camels, leaving only devastation behind. Each blow was heavier than the last, but the final one was unbearable. A lone servant approached, his voice trembling, his eyes avoiding Job's. A mighty wind, he explained, had struck the house where Job's children were gathered for a meal. The building collapsed. None of them survived. In an instant, the world fell silent. There was no explanation, no warning, no reason for such unimaginable loss. The laughter in his home was gone, replaced by an empty quiet. Job fell to the ground, overcome with a grief so deep it felt like the end of the world. He tore his robe and wept. Yet, in that moment of absolute agony, he spoke words that have echoed through centuries. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. His faith didn't erase the pain, but it anchored him, keeping him from being swept away by despair. But the suffering wasn't over. Soon, it reached into his very body. Painful sores erupted all over him, stealing his sleep and his comfort. The man who was once respected and admired now sat in the dust outside the city, scraping his wounds with a piece of broken pottery. People who once sought his advice now passed by, barely recognizing the broken figure before them. Loss had taken his wealth and his family. Now, illness was taking his dignity. His wife, shattered by her own grief and exhausted from watching him suffer, looked at him one day and said what so many might think in that situation: "Are you still holding on to your faith? Curse God and end this." Her words weren't born of cruelty, but of a heart broken beyond repair. Job's response was quiet, but firm. Shall we accept good from God, and not trouble? But even as he spoke those words of faith, the crushing weight of his reality pressed down on him. 3 of his friends came to comfort him. When they first saw him from a distance, they were so shocked by his appearance that they wept aloud. For 7 days and 7 nights, they sat with him in complete silence, because they understood that some pain is too deep for words. But silence can be difficult to maintain, and eventually they began to speak, trying to make sense of the senseless. One friend suggested that Job's suffering must be a punishment for some secret sin. Another insisted that a just God would never allow such pain without a reason. A third urged him to confess his hidden wrongdoing so that his life could return to normal. Their logic sounded so reasonable, so neat. But for Job, their words were like salt in his wounds. He knew he hadn't lived a life that deserved this level of devastation. Their simple answers made his complex pain feel even more isolating. Confused, hurting, and abandoned by easy explanations, Job finally began to speak, his questions aimed at the silent heavens. Why do good people suffer? Why do the wicked seem to prosper? Why does God remain silent when his faithful followers cry out in agony? These weren't the questions of a man turning his back on God. They were the honest cries of a man desperately trying to hold on. Night after night passed with no answers. The silence itself became the heaviest burden. Most of us can endure hardship if we understand the reason behind it. But Job faced his suffering in a vacuum, with no explanation at all. Still, he refused to let go completely. He wrestled with his doubt. He argued with the silence. But he did not walk away. Then, after what felt like an eternity of quiet, his storm began to gather. The wind howled, and from the heart of the whirlwind, God finally spoke. But the answer Job received wasn't the explanation he had been pleading for. God didn't list Job's sins or explain the reason for his pain. Instead, God asked Job questions that revealed the sheer, mind-bending vastness of creation. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Can you command the morning to appear, or show the stars their path? Listening to these questions, Job began to understand. The universe was so much bigger, so much more complex than his human perspective could ever grasp. Faith wasn't about having all the answers, about fitting God into a neat box of cause and effect. Faith was about trusting the one who sees the entire picture, the one who orchestrates galaxies and notices a single falling sparrow. Humbled, Job bowed his head. He admitted that he had been speaking of things too wonderful, too profound for him to ever fully understand. Slowly, gradually, healing began. Life returned. His health was restored. His community embraced him again, and he was blessed with a new family. The scars of his past were never erased. You don't forget that kind of pain, but they no longer defined him. Job learned that restoration isn't about pretending the suffering never happened. It's about learning to live again, with a deeper compassion, a stronger humility, and a more resilient faith. The story of Job isn't really about the suffering, or even about the blessings that came later. It's about the struggle in between. It's about what we do when life feels unfair, when our prayers seem to hit a ceiling, and when the silence from heaven is louder than any voice. It is a powerful reminder that our faith is indeed truly tested in moments of comfort and blessing. It's forged in the fire, in the moments when hope is the hardest thing to find. Because sometimes the greatest act of faith isn't shouting praises from the mountaintop. It's whispering your trust in the dark, in the silence. Thank you for watching. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing for more content that explores the deeper questions of life and faith.